Daniel Morias and Leslie Keller are two awesome camp professionals who over the pandemic started the Equity in Camp initiative and have launched a successful consulting business supporting camps through their DEI journeys. Today, we welcome Daniel to the pod to get some of his smart, eloquent perspective on the work we all need to be doing to ensure that our camp community feels supported during these exciting times. So get out a pen and paper for the last half hour, folks, because this is great stuff. This is the Day Camp Pod.
Great.
All right, so we're gonna rock and roll. I think we're good. I'm gonna warn you guys right now. I was out really late at a concert, so I am not on top of my game. So who knows? That could be good. That could be bad. It's unpredictable Andy we got today.
All right, this is
fuzz-brained Andy, right? But I'm drinking more coffee this morning than I have in a long time. So we're gonna ready to rock and roll.
Ready to go.
All right. Welcome back to the Day Camp Podcast. I'm Andy Pritikin, the director of Liberty Lake in the Philly burbs of New Jersey.
I'm Sam Thompson from Crystal Lake Park District, Crystal Lake, Illinois.
And I'm Tiffany Gratton-McDuffie from Purposeful Play, both in Milwaukee, Wisconsin and Chicago, Illinois.
And today we are continuing our ever strong conversations about DEI and staff and all that fun stuff, which we all want to do better. We're all committed to, and we're all, like, oh, should we do this? Should we go this? Should we do this? And Sam went to a wonderful session with our old friend Leslie that had been on the show a couple of years ago. And Sam, why don't you just tell us what you saw, why you got so jazzed?
Oh, sure. Well, I saw Leslie speak at Women in Camping like 3 years ago, and then we had her on the podcast as well. And at that time, she and Daniel were already thinking of this company that they've started, which I'll let him explain more. And at Nationals, their subject was how equity can be the glue in staff training, which was wonderful. There were a lot of eye-opening biases that we hadn't thought of that they brought up, and some ideas on how to get there. So I'll hand it over to Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Daniel Morais. Pronouns he, him. And so just to give you a little background, we started Equity in Camp initiative a year ago. And it's something that Leslie, who she's not here today, but I'll try to hold the torch for us.
Leslie Weller, right? Let's just give her full due.
Leslie Keller.
We're going to talk about her plenty.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, she's like my best friend. She's like an auntie to my 2.5-year-old as well. So like we're real tight. So you'll hear a lot about her because she's also fantastic. But yeah, so we've been talking about a lot of our just conversations and our friendships, just talking about equity things. And we met several years ago, like almost over 10 years ago, at the camp that we used to work at, and developed this fantastic relationship. And we noticed a lot of our conversations centered around gender equity, racial equity, things like that. And then as we grew in our friendship, it also just grew professionally. We were going to a lot of conferences, and we noticed a lot of things that were what we thought were sort of like voids in the camping conference world. Of like there was some Jedi workshops, but it was like 101, what I mean? It's like, all right, we're already having this conversation. A lot of us have been to a ton of those, but like maybe let's push it more. Let's get deeper. Let's go further with that conversation. And then I think with the sort of racial reckoning that's happened nationally, there's a lot of conversation, and it's become very much a hot topic in camp. And that was something that we've always talked about. And we're like, we should really start something. So a year ago, we launched Equity in Camp initiative. And it was actually sort of spurred by the insurrection that happened in the Capitol, because we are both right in DC. We now both live just outside in Northern Virginia. So, door to door, it's 15 minutes to the Capitol. So it hit very close to home. And so part of this was like sort of our answer to also put some positivity in the world, and also just be the other side of the coin of like, no, like we need to talk about equity. You need to really make sure it's part of the conversation, and the world that we can influence and that we are a part of is camp. So let's bring it to camp. And so by seeing others do it as well, and sort of joining that force that has become a part of the camping world now, that's what we've done. So that's sort of that's sort of our origin story of how we started Equity in Camp Initiative. And it's the past year has been great. We've been doing some trainings, a lot of workshops, as Sam has seen. And like a couple of weeks ago, we were at National, and next week we're at Tri-State. So we're really excited about that.
That's
My first
great.
question to you, Dan,
Yeah.
is equity versus inclusion. How do you see the difference in that? Because a lot of people, it's interchangeable, but I know that people who make this a profession, they separate it a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because like the more that what I love about this, and actually this is something that I've learned from Leslie too, is like language is her passion for language and how it's ever evolving. And when it comes to inclusion, I think there is what I personally think is sort of like a gatekeeping there with inclusion. It's like who is the person that is making the decision for the inclusion part, like who is allowed in and who is not. And so with equity, and so with inclusion, I feel like let's envision like a circle, right? And so we have this door that opens up to let people in, right? And that's like, if we change some policies, some practices, we can open the door for more people to come in, right? I think with equity, what that ends up doing is we can just eradicate that sort of circle and that sort of barrier there, so that it's now accessible to all. So whatever it is, if it's a program, if it's policies, resources, whatever it may be, equity is the ability for us to then make it just accessible to everyone in that way. And so how we make it accessible is also going to be different on the identity, the culture, the experience. And so I think that's where it's not necessarily that everyone gets the exact same thing, the exact same pathway to get there. But the fact that everyone will have access to that resource or program or whatever sort of topic at issue is at hand.
Getting rid of the limitations.
Exactly.
Nice.
Right. So in regard to the thing that Sam saw, the glue for the staff, take us down that path a little bit.
Yeah. So one of my favorite parts of the year is when we start talking about staff training. That's a big part of the experience and what we bring to the table that Leslie and I have. As our many years of being camp directors, that's our bread and butter. Like what we know, we've developed a lot of trainings and we always update it. And we're also firm believers that if you've done it before, that's great. And just because we've done it before doesn't mean we should do it again. I think we can always update it. We can always improve it. And so I have a vivid memory when we were getting ready to talk about staff training. I think it was like 2019, 2020, something like that. And basically what we thought were like, okay, we always picture staff training in like our Jedi workshops or DEIJ workshops as like this section. And then we have like behavior management section, and then we go through our different sections during staff training, right? But with staff training, like we all experience, we always have tons of time, right? And we get through all of the resources and trainings, right? No problem, no hiccups, right? Not true at all, right? What's the first thing that gets cut a lot of times, right? It's the Jedi workshop, because like that's kind of like a nice to have. I think that sort of conversation has changed recently, which is fantastic. And I think there's much more emphasis.
This is becoming as important as the emergency drill. No doubt about it.
And that's, I think, a testament as to where we are, and I think it can go further. But for the longest time, I don't think that was always the case. But then what we realized is like, instead of sectioning it out and thinking like, okay, this is what DEIJ or Jedi is to camp, is this like one workshop and we can fit it all into this bubble. It's like, that's not true. It really touches every other aspect of camp. It touches hiring. It touches it's just part of the DNA and like the fabric of camp. So like hiring, policies, relationship building. And so what we thought was like, okay, well, let's put it in the middle, right? Instead, let's put equity in the middle, and then everything that it goes outwards to like policies and procedures, code of conduct, has an equity lens focused, and let's build our staff training off of that. And so that's what we did. And so then by doing that, what we realized is that we shifted this approach so that it ended up being like a holistic and inclusive and collaborative effort from camp. And it also created like a culture of accountability and visibility for those who are part of camp, which is what I think is a fantastic thing for us to do as camp professionals, and in terms of fostering that like culture and camaraderie within it. So that's sort of the thought process of it.
One of the things that you talked about too that I thought was interesting is you're looking at each of your sections that you do. Even first aid is not equitable because the dummies are white males. There are dummies that look like everyone, and there are dummies with breasts. And why is that a problem? And why are we not, varying even that? So
we were sitting in this, Leslie and I were sitting in a certification course, and what's crazy is the trainer recognized how it was inequitable, and he was like, yeah, I mean, honestly, like statistically it's proven that like women don't receive the same care, and like the success rate is lower for women because like that's just not what like the dummies look like, right? And that's absurd. And as somebody who is a professional and was like teaching it, and he's like, yeah, no, that's just how it is. And I was like, okay, so what are we doing to change that? And there was nothing. And it's like, oh, that's a problem. Like, so that's one of the things that we're like, we need to analyze every single aspect of camp, because by doing so, we're just going to make it better. I mean, from top to bottom, from philosophies, from the campers. And it's also just part of the examples that we're setting is, as like those who are in the like higher positions, if we're doing that from our perspective, then staff will see that, and it will also impact the campers and give them positive experiences.
Yeah, Sam, I love that example. And Daniel, what we need in this podcast is more examples of kind of things like that, because everybody that listens to this podcast, let's say most people that listen to this podcast are bought into this concept. They just don't know how to do the rubber hits the road stuff. They're not seeing it, especially, my typical white, people that grew up, all around white people and all that kind of stuff. And especially guys who are running their camps. It's been a guy, director kind of vibe thing for them during their career. They are sort of ignorant and unaware of a lot of the stuff that they need to be addressing. So when you talk about things like staff training, a lot of people, they're like, we don't even know where to start.
Yeah. The interesting thing too was another one was policies, talking about dress code, and who is the dress code for? A lot of it is biased against what women are wearing, and not so much what the guy counselors are wearing. And so why is that policy in place? Who is it going to benefit, or who has the bias to begin with? So
it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people that take more of the approach that, why shouldn't women be proud of their body? Why do they have to cover it up? Compared to the guys.
Yeah, I think that there's so much, right? And I can understand how people can get like DEI fatigued, where it's just like, because it's so inundating and there's so many things. And just, I think that one of the major keys is just like with anything, you just have to set your goals, do your part, and take it step by step. Because if you try to eat the elephant, right, you choke out. And a big part of that is understanding like where you can begin, and understanding that little incremental changes matter, right? And not to beat yourself up for not being where the next camp is, and just recognizing that being one step ahead of where you were yesterday is progress, right? And there'll be a lot of people who'll say like, no, you need to do more. But at the end of the day, as business owners, if you own the camp, and even if you're just working at a camp, having the awareness is the first step, right? Okay, now I have a lens to know that there were things I wasn't seeing that now I can see. I can identify what they look like from things as you would think, well, it's just meaningless. I'm just trying to teach CPR. Like, why am I getting in trouble for that? But so it's not an attack, more so of a lens to say like, oh, wow, just getting kind of radically curious to say that is an issue. They do have breasts. You know what I mean? Like that could impact how you press and where you press and maybe
where you put your hands. Yeah.
Right. And so not to say like, oh, so we've been doing this wrong this whole time, but to say like, oh, well, maybe next year we'll implement those and see, the crazy thing is then you start getting dummies with breasts and now they cost $20,000 more and it becomes another issue. Right. So I think just the first thing is to identify like, okay, where can we be doing better? And then to really chart it out like we would anything else.
Yeah.
Not to try to, eat the elephant at one time, and then just committing to that action.
So I'm gonna do a quick shout out to one of our sponsors. But when we come back, Daniel, my question to you is going to be: so where do we start with the framework, right? If we're introducing this, where do we start? Okay. But like I said, I want to give a shout out to our friends at AM Skyer, who are one of the leading insurance companies and strategic partners for many of the finest camps in America. AM Skyer partners with camps to provide public relations, legal, medical, behavioral support, and more. And you can experience that difference and get it started at amskyer.com. And one of the things I wanted to tell you about is their support, their unique support in the different areas of dermatologists they have on staff, an ophthalmologist, right? That's willing to do telemedicine with your campers or your staff if necessary, especially my sleepaway camp friends. I'm sure that's great. They have a public health person. They have an employment attorney. My gosh, in this day and age, all the different things that we have to deal with. And so these people are on retainer. They're ready to help. It's all inclusive. And if something does happen where you have to send a letter out to your families or to the public or whatever, they have legal document templates created by their lawyers that are especially useful during the COVID world times. So anyway, check it out, amskyer.com. We appreciate them and for what they do with the Day Camp podcast, and of course, at the ACA National Conference, Tri-State Camp Conference, and all the regional conferences. They are one of the biggest sponsors with all that. All right, so Daniel, as I said, so here's this camp and we're like, okay, we're ready to jump into this, okay? How do we start with this? And like Tiff was saying, like it's something that you chip away with and all, but you sort of do have to set up the framework. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is I think there's sort of two approaches that you'll have to navigate. The first being the sort of year-round staff and the like higher up directors who need to take a very deep look and reevaluation of the policies and the mission and like what it is that you stand for. What is the foundation of camp? And I think a lot of times there have been mission statements and core values that have been ingrained in these camps that have existed for a really long time. But things are changing and maybe they don't necessarily promote exactly what it is that we want to be amplifying right now.
But I think most of these mission statements are pretty inclusive. I think they haven't been interpreted as such. So
yes, like, I think that's actually right.
Like they're really like kumbaya mission statements, but
yeah,
it's not like people necessarily been taught. They've been talking the talk, but not walking the walk.
Yeah.
And I appreciate where you started with this because it does all start from the head of the snake. And I think what most camps experienced last summer was that the tail of the snake was like, yo, head of the snake, we got problems here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And head of the snake was like freezing up a little bit going, oh, all right, well, we're all same. Everything's good, right? It's like, no, not necessarily.
Yeah, no, I think that the thing is there's accountability on every side. So like the higher ups, but also those who are like frontline staff. And I think that's the second part of it. And I think the second part is staff training. I think that's what it is because you sort of get this opportunity to start fresh each summer to a certain degree. And with each staff training that you have, you're going to be able to promote what it is that you're going to center. And I think that's why we've said like equity needs to be the center of that. And so what we've done is we have general questions that with any workshop that you're going to have, we tell people, hey, ask these like list of like 7 questions before you put anything out there, to make sure that you're already in that framework of mind, being like, who's being centered in this workshop? You know, I mean, what particular experience or identity or culture, you know, orientation, whatever it may be. You know, another question might be like, who are we ensuring, like, how are we ensuring that all identities are being valued and are being safe during their time at camp? You know, so they're sort of general questions, so that you're not just going to go and repeat things just because that's what we've done before. I think that's what it is we want an intentional pause before we put anything out there to really think about what is the message that we're putting out. Another one's like, you know, is our language up to date? Because again, language is ever evolving, and like certain terms within Jedi that we used before, maybe like, you know, for one that comes to mind is like, you know, minorities, right? Like racial minorities or something like that. That's shifted to the point now that it's like intentionally excluded individuals, you know what I mean? Because, you know, there are individuals and people who are within the camp community or just society as a whole who have been, because of the systems that are in place, have legitimately been intentionally excluded, because that's how the system was designed to work, right? So those are those sort of types of language tidbits that we need to update to make sure that we are being, you know, on the front line of and the cutting edge of, you know, this type of work.
Yeah. Well, all encompassing too. So we're not leaving out anybody. That's the big thing. And you know,
exactly,
for camps that have for years been taking in kids with special needs, kids that speak other languages, all that kind of thing. We've been trying to be inclusive, but we've been missing subsections.
Andy, that was a great segue into a thought I had, is when you were talking about the fare is not all the same. With inclusion, with special needs, we've always thought that fare is what they need, not just flat across the board. And that, I think more people understand now what we mean when we say that. But you were, like you were saying, with the inclusion, we're getting a better handle on it for those kind of different needs, but we need to get, how can we transfer that to getting a better handle on what people need here, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, you know, as I was mentioning with like the sort of general questions, what we've done is then also breaking it down into further subsections. So like what we did was we approached staff training from like the building relationships standpoint. And so, you know, when we're talking about building relationships and that sort of workshops that we're going to have within that, we're talking about like, you know, are these who's being like centered within like the conversations about trust. We're talking about like, are the opportunities and activities at camp equally accessible to everyone there? Or do they normalize more, or do they center like more normalized interests? And, you know, normalized, I say in quotations because like what is normal, right? Like that's not a thing. That's something we've talked about over and over in our workshops. But I think that's where our approach is coming from, in terms of having the opportunity to not sort of section it out within like these sort of general topics. It's really, again, it's having equity be in the middle, so that when we have each of these sections, you still include like the daily operations. We're still going to talk about behavior management, and like behavior management, for example, example of how like equity would be included in that is like, let's talk about are there any patterns of behavior, right, with our campers? So what we had talked about was having our camp directors sit down, pull out all those behavior incidents, because, you know, you should have your behavior incidents written up and you should have that in your files. Pull them out, take a look at what's happened in our camp. Are there particular identities or particular campers of a particular group that happen to be, you know, let's say disciplined or talked to more so than others? Why is that? Let's break down what is it about our approach and our teaching methods that may be biased or inequitable, right? And again, that then turns the question as to like, what are our teaching methods founded on? Are they founded on maleness, you know, white, cis, hetero, normalcy, you know, stuff like that? And or is it just geared towards neurotypical campers? You know, again, it's really asking those questions to find out what is the foundation that we are using to guide our staff, which in turn will guide our campers.
I'm revved up by so many things that you said. Like I really enjoyed intentionally excluded people. But I play devil's advocate. I don't have a contrarian viewpoint. That's a better term
Okay.
on all things. And so like that is going to be very challenging for white people to say, right? Like they're not, that's like admitting, that's a lot, And so I guess my lens is always from like, what is the one next thing that people who really, I won't say are only interested, I won't say are only interested because it's a trending topic right now, but who never really paid attention until they saw the George Floyd thing, you know what I mean? Or never really paid attention. Like it's a lot to take people who never cared, intentionally or not, ignorantly or not, from that to like, we intentionally excluded them. Now recognize, and to even recognize that using language like minority is already saying you're less than me, you're smaller than me, I'm bigger than you. Like those realizations are like emotional intelligence through the roof. So I always challenge my DEI people, DEI, JEDI, I swear the acronym just keeps going. It's amazing what you all can do with it. To say like I don't think any of it matters without EQ, like emotional intelligence, unless you're building the emotional intelligence of people to get them to really consume why this matters, right? And you would think seeing someone die, like, but getting them to translate from that big thing to like how this translates into your camp is, I'm very curious on your perspective from that as of like a first step, like DEI for Dummies edition, because I think when you try to take them from 0 to 100, it's overwhelming, and then people get paralyzed and they do nothing.
Yeah, before he answers, I want to tell you what we're thinking about at my camp in regard. That's a great question, Tiff. I think that when most people have a conversation about bias, about like the bias that you grew up with, what do you call that? Inherent bias. They really can't deny it. Most people grew up with somewhat racist parents. That's what it just seems like at this point. And they could recognize that and appreciate that they were brought up in that world. And there are things that they are saying and doing that they probably don't realize are microaggressions, like the minority thing. Like that's a wonderful example of something that is just institutionalized, in society now. And then, but the thing that we're taking in our camp approach, and fortunately we have enough of a diverse community that we now have plenty of kids that are now counselors and can speak on it, and they can talk about what it was like when they were a kid. And the one big commonality that a lot of people have, whether they recognize or not, and because the whole colorblindness thing is huge, like kumbaya, like we're all equal, what's a big deal, everybody, that's a big problem I think that camps have, is that everybody works at camp because they think that everybody's equal and everything's great and all this kind of stuff. They don't realize everything that's around, right? But then when you hear from the mouth of babes from, well, when I was a kid, this happened, and when I was a kid, this freaked me out, and when I was a kid, I'm still thinking about this thing that happened 8 years ago, kind of thing like that. Then you realize that what we're doing here is about the kids too. Like we're talking about staff training and staff. And people are thinking, well, it's how we relate to each other as staff. We don't want to piss off each other as staff. But this is a camp. It's all about the kids. And all these things are happening to these kids who are of color, who are trans, who are whatever, who are not the typical kid, right? And to me, it always comes back to that. Are all kids created equal here? All right. Do we want to treat all kids the same? Do we want kids to be on a level playing field? Everybody's going to say yes to that. And if we just keep on reverting to that as the, hey, remember what we said, right? All kids. All right.
Yeah. So there's so many things that I want to touch on. I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm ready. Tiff, I want to go back to one of the things that you're saying about the intentionally excluded part and having that be kind of something that would be difficult, for white people to sort of accept or, utilize. I recognize that, but I also think how, this may seem kind of like harsh, but like, it's also now by not using that term because it may not be easy for them to use in that way is then centering their perspective and now not centering those who are intentionally excluded in their experiences. So I think that's why it's also very much an important aspect or reason why to use it, because it's like, no, this is actually the experience and what is actually happening. Like there are, Black and brown people who are being intentionally excluded. There are trans kids who are being intentionally excluded, whatever it may be. Like, no, let's call it what it is. And we're not going to skirt around that issue. You know what I mean? We need to call it what it is, which is exclusion. And to be honest, exclusion is like the I guess like kind of the nicest thing that could be happening, because it is way worse. I mean, let's be real. There's blood that's having shed. You know what I mean? There's a lot of trauma. So I think that's one thing to sort of keep in mind, that like, yes, okay, like that might be hard for you to like learn a new term and why it's being utilized, but like you also need to understand why we need to evolve the language and update that language, because there are real lives at stake. And then, to your point about, all right, so somebody who's just sort of getting caught up to speed and like everything that's happening right now, I have had that conversation with a lot of people. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is this is where it's very much, especially those who are like allies and accomplices. And I love the term accomplice in that way, because like you're really getting into the fight, and really, getting your hands dirty. But I think that's where, like, especially, if we're talking about racial equity, an opportunity for those to really step up and be a conversation starter, or individuals to sort of bounce those initial conversations off of. Because to be honest, I think it's also tough for, if again speaking like from like a racial equity lens, for Black and brown people to have to shoulder that conversation right off the bat in a lot of experience, or in a lot of instances, because I have heard many times like, well, like you sort of have to like meet them halfway, and like you sort of need to like have to give them time, and and stuff like that. And I definitely agree that that you have to do that and account for that as well, because we all have different experiences and whatnot. But I also think that's where, somebody who potentially has had to experience that personally for their entire lives, it is very tough to have that conversation and be like, okay, like, I don't really know how to tell you to care about me or those who look like me and what I'm going through. And like, if like I have to sort of wait for you to like kind of come around that to the idea that like somebody who looks like me is okay to be in this space, or that I should be valued or centered, then like, maybe I'm not the person to have this conversation right now. Maybe you need to talk to somebody who is of the same experience or identity, to then like have those initial sort of one-on-one, conversations, to then get them up to speed. Yeah, so that was one of the first things I wanted to mention.
I love that. And I think that is a great answer, right? And I think that is where the accomplices, and I call them advocates, but same, come into play, because then you all have the patience, because the advocates or the accomplices will have the patience without being offended that I have to convince you to care about, my plight, because you think from a humanity perspective, it should be common sense. But because some things are so deeply rooted, right, it is the unlearning and the uprooting that causes the resistance. And so when I said I was asking from a contrarian perspective, I have white friends who speak very candidly to me, but would not in a group of a bigger group. And so I love to be like, okay, no, so this is what they're thinking, but they won't ask. And I can't speak for everybody, of course, but I have friends that are thinking this, but they won't ask. So let me ask on their behalf. And not that it's my job, but I like to educate and inform, and to be able to be a resource, like, do the tough stuff. And also recognizing like, it's not going to be easy. Like, who said that you thought that this was you doing uprooting institutionalized racism was going to be an easy job? It was going to feel good. Like, it's not going to feel good. And just lean into knowing that from the beginning.
Feelings will be hurt.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. And I do think that there's it's also great for somebody to, let's say, sit in the workshop that we do in terms of like equity and how it can be the glue to staff training, and really have these like sort of in their minds or perspective, like radical ideas, because at the end of the day, at least they're thinking about it, and at least they're like, wait, what? And then I even just want that reaction, if at the very least, you know what I mean? Because at least they're thinking about it, like, and sort of questioning, like, well, that's not my experience, or that's not how I've seen things. And maybe like, oh, maybe I should consider it from a different perspective, or like, maybe there's something to this, like, you know? So at least that's why I think there is still some value to it. And like, not to say that like, if you don't have that sort of intro foundation understanding of, you know, Jedi, that it's not, you know, for you.
Can we talk about the Jedi thing? Where's that come from? Because, you know, I'm a huge Star Wars fan and I'm a huge DEI fan, and like, you keep throwing that word around. What do you mean with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's just everyone sort of used, you know, DEI, and then you throw in J for justice, and then they're like, well, instead of DEIJ, let's make a Jedi. And so as also a Star Wars fan, I kind of want to keep Jedi like a Star Wars thing, and I prefer like DEIJ, but either way, as long as the conversations being had in all of those letters are being accounted for, that's all that really matters for me.
My favorite extra letter is the B, because I've had this explained to me a bunch of times by people who really believe in this, that that we can do all of these things and put all these things in place and talk about language and do the training and all that kind of stuff. But until everybody feels like they belong, you know, it really, we're not accomplishing it. And so to me, that's the aspirational goal, is the B that we're trying to get, that we want people who are not the typical, you know, as you said, like white, cis, blah, blah, blah kind of people, to be like, I feel like I belong here. This is my happy place. Like, that's what we're looking for.
Don't worry, they got Jedi B for you. They just gonna keep Jedi B.
That's the blue lightsaber. I get it. All right.
Now,
All right.
the nice thing about Daniel and Leslie too is Leslie's really good at the gender bias conversation, and brings up a lot of things that people don't think about gender-wise when they're planning, when they're training, and all that. So my question, Daniel, I know Leslie had given us a link to a survey on figuring out if your job descriptions were biased. And then yesterday or the day before, Jackie Fullock had put a link on summer camp professionals about figuring out if your job references are biased. And so do you have any resources, or do you want to put some of the stuff from your presentation in the show notes that then people can use to get that start? Like those 7 questions, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that I actually emailed over was our equity lens questions. And what we did was, as I mentioned before, we broke our staff training into like certain sections, like learning and growth, relationship building, mesh planning, so like mental, emotional, social health plan, and fostering collaboration and connection. And what we've done is like everyone who comes to our workshops, and then for those who are listening, you'll have it in the show notes too, prompts for each one of those sections when you're talking about staff training or just conversations about camp, and like actually there's equity lens questions within those sections, because that's one of the things that we are really excited about and jazzed about, is that again, it then adds more eyes to it, because you're now including more experiences, more identities, more cultures, when we are accounting for everyone. And going back to what Andy said, like ensuring that like they belong, because like I think that's how you promote and perpetuate that feeling of belonging. Because like if you're going to account for my experience, then you're going to center me in these conversations, then that's how you achieve this. So these questions are designed to achieve that, so that when you're talking about your policies and you're updating your staff training, or you're having those conversations with campers and staff, that they're at the forefront of mind. Because I think, again, going back to what was said here, the goal is to teach and positively impact our campers. And I think that's how we do it. I think in one of the workshops, a different workshop that we have called You Can't Have It Both Ways. And it's talking about how you just can't sit back and be quiet, or just like complicit on this. Like you need to be vocal on what you stand for as an organization. And the reason why is because that's how you're going to show your campers and your staff that you care about what is happening outside of camp. I think it's actually a disservice when you don't account for them as a whole and only center or value the aspect that is like pertinent to like their particular, whatever is like part of your camp. If it's like wilderness, like sort of their outdoorsy personality, whatever it may be. But like, let's be real, they are human beings who experience all these things throughout the rest of the year. And if we're just going to negate that during camp and not talk about it, what sort of message does that send, right? So like, we're just then telling like, that's not important right now, that's not what we're really here for, like, but we're here for them and their experiences as a part of them. So that's why I think that's how we actually show our campers and staff that like, no, we see you as a whole and what you go through, and we are here for you. We are a support system and we are a community. I think that is something that the camping world uses all the time, is community. And for me, that is how you show up for your communities, being an advocate, being a support, and amplifying and making everyone who's a part of that community.
Right. And I think that goes back to the talking the talk and walking the walk thing. I think every camp talks talk, but you know, talk to your people of color, your LGBTQ community people, right? And you'd be surprised how they don't necessarily feel like you got their back. And I think one of the ways that you could see that also is see how many of those folks, when they were campers, have now turned into staff. It's not as high as a percentage, because you may have thought that they were being supported, but they really didn't. They didn't feel it. And therefore they didn't want to become staff members. And everybody's like, how do we get more diverse staff? Well, take care of your kids, you know, to start with.
Yeah. Two things to add there. You know, the camp that we used to work at, like we created a DEIJ task force. And one of the things we did off the bat was did a survey to be like, all right, we don't know how to make things better unless we know the status of where we're at right now. So, you know, I have to be honest, I was like, all right, I think, you know, I talked to a lot of my staff, I have great relationships with them and stuff like that. And I was like, all right, let's put this out there. And I was a little nervous. It's like, I really hope that we have this anonymous survey and what comes back matches like what I've seen, what I've heard. Luckily that was the case. So I felt I was able to like breathe a sigh of relief, but I think that's exactly it. Is like, you need to have those conversations and like be vulnerable. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be tough for a lot of people, is like, you know, sometimes you don't want to ask the questions you don't want to hear the answers to, but that's how you're going to make positive changes, sustainable change.
Creating a survey right now and trying to pare it down to make it, you know, not 20 questions. You know, but,
I think my first one was like 30, and I think we got it back to like 18.
Well, Daniel, I'm going to get your email address later. You can share me your task force thing, because we're going to create a task force. It's going to be one of the questions. Do you want to be part of the task force? It's going to be one of the questions.
Yeah. Perfect.
All right, so before we wrap things up, I do want to give some love out to our friends at CRS, Commercial Recreation Specialists, who help bring this podcast to you. They are the fine purveyors of the best recreation solutions to keep camp growing strong. You can check them out at crs4rec.com. They are big on the waterfront, folks. Whether you have a pool or a puddle or a pond or whatever, anything with water, they have some things as crazy as inflatable floating tracks that you can put in the water, and the kids go running across them like a bunch of ninja warriors, to anything from lifeguard chairs and floating lifeguard towers. I bought a handicap thing that lowered people into the water which has been very useful, and you know, got to do it out of legalities as well these days. Rescue tubes, boats, all that kind of safe swimming stuff. And one of my favorite things that they do, which you can get from plenty of other places, I'm sure, is those SUPs, which are the giant boards you stand on and go paddle boards, right? Man, my kids can't get enough of that. So anyway, CRS, Commercial Recreation Specialists, as they like to say, they are serious about fun. CRS4rec.com. All right, something I just want to address, going back to that, you got to start with the head of the snake and all that kind of thing. And I was sort of delineating between the head of the snake and the tail of the snake. A big difference between the head and the tail is age and generational, right? And I feel like the kids at our camps and our younger staff, if they walked into a classroom right now and half the kids were transgender, they wouldn't blink an eye. They wouldn't, right? But the people who are, let's say 40, 50, 60, you know, who it's still new to them in some ways and have trouble grasping it, it's almost, that's a huge battle at a camp, because camps are so multi-generational. and you're you can't, and like you said, you have to meet some of those older folks halfway in a way to get them to sort of buy in and understand and all those things. But meanwhile, the younger people are like, come on, let's get it going. We're already like 3 years behind on this. Like, come on, let's move it. And that to me is a struggle I see across the board.
A good example of that was my language that I used when I was talking about my kids with different needs. I call them special needs. That's because I've been around too long. It's an old language that should not be used anymore. I should have said non-neurotypical. So getting out of the habit of using those old language phrases that you did that are now offensive.
Well, and so what I'm sort of getting to in part of this, Daniel, is that when you go into a camp and you got this multi-generational thing and you're like, okay, so we need to sort of stop with like implicit bias and all those kind of things. But like, we have to address like microaggressions 101 and stuff like that too, because they're just basic things like calling people minorities. You just mentioned, like, that's an eye-opening one to me, where people are they're just ignorant. Like they just don't realize what they're doing.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tiff.
No, I was just going to say, people, I think the solution, and Daniel's the expert here, but my emotional intelligence is my thing. People have to get okay with being corrected. I think that's the answer to it all, because at the end of the day, you're never going to get it all right? So you need to have enough tough skin. So like Daniel talked about, I was going to say, feedback is the breakfast of champions. It's hard to go and get, but it's so essential, right? And it gives data. That's all it is, that we all are getting more data. So what some example that Daniel was given today has my response to what Andy just asked is like, that's just how the people felt when they first walked in the classroom and there was Black kids in the classroom after integration, like after segregation ended. So, oh, wow, they're here now. What does it mean? Yeah, you're gonna have to get over it and get over it quick. And yeah, that is the expectation. Otherwise, it's like we're never like, at the root of it all, we're all human people. And that doesn't give people who are of different sexual orientations, or like, if we're all, no matter what we are, no matter what our pronouns are, if we are acting with good adjectives, like if we are kind, and if we are empathetic, and if we are all of these core values that camp swears it has, a lot of this becomes a non-issue. It's because we're so focused on the pronouns and not the adjectives, that for me is where the problem comes. Because if you are loving and kind and you care for all people and you want to serve all humanity, then what the person looks like or identifies as from a sexual orientation or their skin color really shouldn't matter. So it's about self-awareness and your own self-check to say, you the one that's tripping.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's why setting that precedence and setting that expectation that, that's why I love saying that, like, any sort of space that I'm in, like, it's a growth, has like a growth mentality. Like, that means that if you're going to grow, like, that means you're going to trip up sometimes. It means you're going to make some mistakes, but at least you're like working towards a goal of being better, or at least making your space better, and being positive in that way. So then that way, by having that be the culture surrounding your camp, when those moments happen, they'll be tough, but at least like, this isn't going to define me, and this is only going to help me in my journey, but also just help us as a community here be better by being able to digest this and learn and correct it going forward, so I don't make that same mistake. So I do agree, Andy, that like it needs to be part of that conversation to know that it's okay to mess up, because we all will. We are all humans, so we all mess up, so that, again, like we will be better.
Yeah, that's a question that we've been asking everybody this year on the podcast, because what happened last summer was everybody was so stressed out last summer. People didn't have the tolerance to deal with the frustrations. Mm-hmm. And people were just like, nope, that's it, I can't deal with it. Well, you're canceled, blah, blah, blah. Like, people didn't have the patience for that. So it really is important to set that framework up. And I love, as usual, the language that Tiff uses. People have to be okay with being corrected.
Yeah,
that is just.
And I'll add to that one quick thing, Andy. So like, people who are doing the things have to be okay with being corrected, and the people who are automatically going to cancel culture have to be okay with giving people grace, right? Because we are all learning, and they're not perfect, right? Like, who's perfect among us? So okay with being corrected on the one side and the giving people grace, like it's going to take that combination in order to move forward. Because if all you're going to do is cancel people who, if we just take like the seriousness out of this and say that it's a mistake or say that they don't know, even if we think they should, if you're going to cancel everybody that has the mistake, kill the whole earth, like everybody gone.
What's left?
So,
yeah.
All right, I want to end on that because that was prophetic. That was awesome. Thank you so much. And Daniel, I just got to say, you have a voice made for podcast, buddy. You got that rich, low baritone going, man. You sound good in a microphone.
Well, right? I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And also, thank you so much for having us or having me today, but Leslie and myself as well.
Yes. We really appreciate you being on. So how do people find more about you and Leslie's initiative?
Yeah. You can find us either through email or Instagram. Email, we're info@equityincamp.com, or on Instagram, we are @equityincamp-initiative. We're active on both. Definitely reach out if you have any consulting, staffing needs. If you just want to chat, we've been having great conversations with those who really just want to talk about camp and just equity and anything that encompasses that. Or if you just want to hang out, let us know. We're here.
That's really awesome. That's great. And look for them at your nearest regional ACA conference, ladies and gentlemen. We want to thank our Go Camp Pro team, AM Skyer, and commercial recreation specialists for allowing us to bring this podcast to you. And if you like what you hear, you should subscribe to the Day Camp Pod on your favorite podcast platform. Check out the show notes for this and other podcasts at daycamppodcast.com, as well as contact information for the show, for our guests, and for me, Sam and Tiff. Daniel, send us anything you want to throw out there, links wise, and we can get it up, okay, and share it around. We'll be posting it all over the place. Thanks for listening, and make yourself a better Day Camp Pro. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the Day Camp Pod.